most of my time is spent looking at branding, and Pak Hermawan spoke about branding this morning. Why branding? Because I think in this world full of lots of things, images, information, and communication, it's a quick way to understand what's going on. A brand is designed a bit like a flag. It's a logo and all the other things that you know about. I'm talking to marketers, right? But it's there to identify something. So for me, it's a very quick way to identify what's going on. I think beyond the standard definitions, they are what? Meaning creators, language shapers, and game changers. Why game changers? Because you put a logo or a brand on something and you can charge a bit more, right? If it's a bad brand, then maybe you can't. Language shapers. Why? Because we Google things now. We do a wiki. Brands are becoming commonplace. They're a part of our human existence. When there are so many ways that we can connect, probably the first things we do is talk about brands. My brand, Manchester United, right? I was born in Manchester. People don't connect with me because I'm British. They connect with me because I'm from Manchester, especially now that Manchester United is mid-league, right? Meaning creators, because we spend a lot of time in branding talking about the art of storytelling and stitching together seemingly unconnected things. So, as part of this journey of trying to understand brands and branding and how that works in the global marketplace, I came across something on the side. Because whilst I was trying to understand this, I spoke to academics and practitioners from all over the world. And I stumbled across something which was, what skills do you need to be good at branding or good at management? Or even I would extend that to, what skills do you need? What should we be looking for? Now, one of the things that we're very good at in marketing or even consumerism, and I would extend that, especially with some of the developing nations, is this idea of people being aliens or ambassadors. What do I mean by that? What I'm actually trying to argue is that if we spend a lot of time saying that we're different, so as you can see from this picture of the Malaysian pop star, Yuna, Islam is on the radar for a lot of good reasons currently. People are very interested in what the Muslim world is doing. And the Muslim world is very good at the minute of saying, well, excuse me, we're here and we're different. Now, my argument is, if you spend a lot of time saying why you're different, great if you want to launch a product like halal. Muslims are different, therefore they consume halal. Or Islamic finance is different than conventional finance. Or any of these things that you might have read in the press. But if it's so different, you alienate yourself. Because people say, oh, well, you're not like us. Or you're completely different. But then at the other end of the spectrum, if you're an ambassador, what are ambassadors very good at? Creating a veneer of everything is okay. So from the same token, with some of my research going through the Muslim world, I've noticed that people often talk in the third person, or they say, we Muslims do this, or we're one ummah, or we're all the same. And in doing some of these things, then if people are watching, and especially if you're on the outside, you go, yeah, right. We get on. We're completely the same. Well, maybe if you've been to Mecca, then you will see that we are the same for a little bit of time, right? Going around the Kaaba in Mecca. But on a day-to-day business, I would argue that we're neither aliens nor ambassadors then. So what is it really about? Authenticity is a word that keeps cropping up. It's cropped up over the past couple of days. And I would say that these are the ABCs. Authenticity, balance, and communication. Our perspective on people has to be balanced. It can't be too much about alienation or too much about ambassadorship. But ultimately, it's about driving this thing, communication. So, with those things in mind, I went on my journey and I thought to myself, how then could I understand people? What would help me to understand consumers, colleagues in the workplace, teams that I have to manage, or even from a recruitment perspective, what questions could I ask? And I decided that looking at objects and associations are quite important. Now, on a very superficial level, you might say, does that mean what handbag I have, what watch I use, whether I support Chelsea or Manchester United or Manchester City? On a superficial level, yes. But what I'm suggesting to you is that actually objectification and associations are also intangible. It's not just the object itself, but what does it mean? So I started to ask questions about artifacts. You know, think about your favorite hobbies. Think about your favorite souvenirs. Think about your favorite ornaments. What do they say about you? Think about your favorite movies. Think about your favorite food. Those things fascinated me because I thought if I'm going to try and work with people and understand them, then maybe they're a bit more important than what country were you born in? How old are you? How many qualifications do you have? But I found that when I apply for jobs, what they really want to know from me is what is my date of birth? What's the color of my passport? What's my address? And from my postcode, maybe they can tell something about me. And, you know, how many letters do I have before or after my name? They don't really tell you much about me. I could tell you a lot more. I could tell you that probably the things that shaped my working life were working as a cleaner in a hospital whilst I was studying, playing bass guitar in a rock band, playing rugby for my country. All of those things have had a more profound effect than sitting in a chemistry laboratory titrating some chemical that I forgot the name of and I'd never remember much past sitting the exam and then forgetting that information. So, I decided that I would ask people some different questions. And these are the questions that I'm going to suggest you could ask. For me, it's not about experience. It's about experiences. It's not work experience, but it's the experiences that you have. So, for example, if somebody wants to know about your professional experience, I would say your professional experiences. You could ask somebody how many years they've worked on something. Fine. But I would like to know all of the jobs that you've ever had, not the relevant ones, the irrelevant ones as well, thank you very much. So I asked participants, some of them with 30 years experience, some of them with 2 years experience, what jobs have you done? The reason I've put years of experience there is not so that people can say, excuse me, I've been working for a very long time, therefore I know better, but actually because I wanted to test, what about the graduate that's straight out of business school that's got 2 years work experience? Maybe they understand branding better than the person that's been working for 20 years and hasn't read any recent literature on branding. So I actually found that if you take this data, the year's experience and the positions held, and then for 1 minute put them to one side and ask the same questions, anonymized, funnily enough, people with only a couple of years experience can articulate some really interesting things, perhaps even more eloquently than people with 20 years experience. Not to say that one is better than the other, but I think it's interesting. The next things that I wanted to know are the brands. So I spent some time asking people, what brands do you like? What don't you like? Why? What brands have you worked on? Looking at the industry sector or the number. Even if you don't work in branding, I just wanted a really quick way to see what your network of associations are so that I could stitch them together. Another interesting thing I found is that even if you work for the BBC or quote-unquote cool brands, it tended to be the case that people preferred other brands than the brand that they work for. Also interesting, because I thought, well, if I was running a company, I'd like people first and foremost to say, the brand that I like is the brand that I work for. So maybe Pak Hermawan, you could ask the same question. What's their favorite brand, right? Ask your employees. So a number of things that you could then extrapolate according to reach, size, you know, value, data, all of these things. But finally for me, the most interesting thing was cultural exposure. Now, coming from the UK's probably got the most employment legislation, probably got the most protection compared to other countries. So I realized that we had to be sensitive about what questions you asked and how they're interpreted in the workplace. But what I wanted to know was about which countries have you been to for work and for pleasure? What languages can you speak? And then perhaps the most interesting thing here, the ethnicity linked to your social network. So you might think, okay, fine, if you were me, I would put down Scottish and Caribbean. Not enough. What I actually want to know is what is your network of association? So I spend a lot of time doing Japanese martial arts, right? So I have to put Japan down. I spend a lot of time watching Kung Fu movies. I have to put down China. I spend a lot of time eating Indonesian food when I have the opportunity. I have to put down Indonesia, because actually I want to know what your associations are, your links with various countries, and it's really about the emotional attachment. And Rob, I remember you mentioning you married someone from Hong Kong. So I would ask you to put Hong Kong down in that category, because I think otherwise people are missing the point, because if they see you, they think, oh, Western guy, what does he know about Asia? Well, probably a lot, right? Someone who's also married to, you know, my wife's family are from Pakistan. I can tell you a lot of things about Indian subcontinent culture, perhaps more because as an outsider, if you're used to people, you know, you pick up things quite quickly, right? Because it's not maybe your culture. So I'm asking all of these questions, but it's with a view to understand how you can build a team. The good thing as well is that people like to answer those questions because it's fun. The good thing as well is that we get to know each other a lot better, a lot more enjoyable. Ultimately then, what I'm suggesting, that if you put all of those things together, and I put this in an article in the Marketeers magazine, I tried to make things fairly straightforward, A to G, right? I'll go through them quite quickly. Articulate. If you think about the word articulation, and one of the other things that I tend to do when I look at branding and people is I like studying words individually. I also like looking at phrases. So, you know, some people have asked me, why is my hair so long? Well, I remember the Japanese phrase that the nail that sticks out the furthest gets hammered down the first. So I had to get some protection. I also remember that in the UK, they tell you that you shouldn't burn your bridges, but then Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago, said burn your bridges. So how does that work, right? So through interrogating literature and idioms and phrases and looking at some of the data that when I spoke to people, I arrived at this conclusion where I think first and foremost, articulation is key. By articulation, what I mean is not just the art of communicating or language, but also if you think about an articulated lorry or an articulated insect, it's joining things together, it's linking things. And that's key to innovation, and Professor Wolcott mentioned it, linking together seemingly unconnected things. Probably the best way to do that is to tell a story, right? From then, branding is a good way to label it. There's no use telling a story people can't identify or they can't grab hold of it. Credibility, same as trust, right? Thing about authenticity and credibility is you kind of need more than one person to ratify whether that's true. It's no good saying that you're authentic if you don't get a reciprocal response that says you are authentic. Or how can you say, trust me, if there's no one with which to judge whether you can be trusted or not? Dedication is key. This can't be done overnight. Emotional intelligence is definitely key. Beyond rationality, beyond functionality. Functionality can only be achieved after you have emotional intelligence. One of my, for example, criticisms when I was in Dubai a couple of weeks ago looking at Islamic finance is they spent all of this time looking at a product saying that it's Sharia compliant. What about the person? Is the person Sharia compliant? By that, what I mean is, do they practice what they preach? Do they have a code of ethics? I don't really care about my bank's products having a code of ethics, but I'd like to know that the guy or the lady behind the desk does. I think if that can be remedied, then it's easier to defend some of the other perspectives. So functionality in a modern marketplace, I would argue, can be achieved when you have the right people. We've moved past industrialization and manufacture, and in a human economy, we're looking at a knowledge economy, it's about the person. Right people will deliver functionality. And then ultimately, it's about giving, altruism. If you give in the hope that you will receive, I think that you'll have a long, long life and a very happy life and a good business. I'm getting the magic tea. So, I'm going to give over the mic in the spirit of giving, and I'd like to say thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Where's Rob? Rob, please make short conclusion. Yeah. Conclusion of all three other panelists, maybe, because I know you are very smart in doing that.
Wow. It's easier to do a conclusion when you know you're actually going to do a conclusion. Minister, problems to opportunities. That's the key. One of the things that differentiates entrepreneurial people from everyone else is that entrepreneurial minds see the opportunities first. So we are brought up in order to, in our first jobs, in our schooling, to identify the constraints. How does the system currently operate? What are the requirements? And if we know those constraints and requirements, we can fit within that space and work happens properly. And that's good for day-to-day business, for the way that we already operate, because you become an expert at that. But what most people do then when they hear a new idea or a new concept is they immediately default to the constraints of the existing system and say, aha, that's not going to work because of these constraints. The entrepreneurial person is, if they're smart, they're not being stupid, they ignore the constraints, not forever, but they ignore the constraints at first. And they say, wow, look at that idea, that opportunity. What are all the things we could do in an ideal world? So it's not that they're saying, oh, there are no constraints and we're just going to be stupid and waste all of our money. Instead, they're saying, we haven't spent any money yet. All we're doing is ideating, which is an interesting word. All we're doing is thinking about what could be, all the opportunities, all the ways we could make money, all the ways we could make the world better. And then after they've played with it for a while and made it bigger, diverged, made it more exciting, seen all the opportunity that we've heard about the last day and a half, then they step back later, if they're smart, and they say, okay, what are the constraints as they currently exist? And they go out and they find experts who know how the world currently exists, how the industry currently operates. And then they say, okay, here are all the constraints. Here are, other people would look at them and say, here are all the reasons why this idea won't work. The entrepreneurial person says, okay, here's the big idea, or the ideas. Here are the constraints. What can we do about the constraints? They look at a couple of the constraints and they say, you know what, these constraints, we're not going to be able to change them. One of them is, well, it's a law of physics, and I'm not going to spend time trying to change a law of physics. Okay, so we're going to have to change our idea a little bit. No anti-gravity machine in this. Okay, fine. Then they look at another constraint and they say, it's against the law. Okay, now that's an interesting one. Usually you want to avoid that. That's probably a bad thing to be breaking laws. But sometimes you can actually advocate to have laws changed. And then that's a strategic decision. Do we work hard to try and change the law or the interpretation of the law? Or do we say that is an inviolable constraint? That is a constraint we cannot change, so we will change our idea and our approach. And then they look at other constraints and they say, you know, that constraint looks like a constraint to everybody else in the industry, but when we really think about it, who cares? We don't need to do it like that. We can try something new. We can do a prototype. We can go out and work with some customers and see if they like it, if it works for them. Maybe that constraint is simply an orthodoxy. Maybe that constraint is simply an assumption that everyone has about the world that turns out to be wrong. And so then they find those constraints that they believe could and should be changed and challenged. That's an entrepreneurial person taking problems and instead thinking opportunities. And the minister talked about turning the river from a backyard to a front yard. These are untapped resources. So I would take that analogy into your own experience, in your own jobs. Are there backyards that are bothering you? Are there backyards that are causing problems for your business? And sit down with your team. If it's important, sit down with your team and ask the simple question, can we turn that backyard into a front yard? Is there some way we can turn this into an advantage? Now, the answer at the end of an hour discussion might be no, there isn't. It's just a backyard and we got to try and get rid of it. But on the other hand, we might find ways to turn the backyard into a front yard. Eco, fabulous. And you've got a sense of humor too, which is good. But Pa Hermawan, as we heard, laughs at everything. So that's good. That's good. It's part of living life in the right way. And I learned about the island thing, which is fascinating. I can't wait to use that back at Kellogg because the world changes and changes back. But open education, you guys here, it turns out, have been doing this open education thing for a decade, and I didn't even know about it. So I want to learn more about this, because what Iko has been doing, he and his team have been doing for years now, is the classic disruption. It is disruptive innovation at its best, because disruptive innovation generally comes at the low end or the very high end, and it seeks to serve people who are currently not being served, or it seeks to serve people who are currently overserved or can't afford the very high-end, very expensive version. And it gives them something cheaper and simpler but serves their immediate need. But what happens over time, as Iko knows, as the professor knows, that cheap thing, that lower quality thing, if it works, starts to get better. And gets better and better over time, and then maybe eventually overtakes the core model. Because it can do more things than the old model could do. It could do new things that the old model couldn't. Moving to Harvard for 4 years and spending a lot of money and being in that magical, extraordinary place with the faculty and your colleagues, it's a wonderful thing. But online education, bringing content from so many people and universities around the world, can allow us to do things we could never do before. Whether we're in a rural area in Kalimantan and we don't have access to education, or whether perhaps we have access to everything in the world, we might decide to start to avail ourselves of open education of various types. It's very powerful, and it happened here in Indonesia. And Jonathan, one thing I took away from your comments, getting to know people, not data. Because we, as marketers, as researchers, have a tendency to default to the data, and even business leaders so often say, son, you have to understand, at this company, we make decisions based on data. If you can give us data, then we're all right with that. And I guess that, you know, that makes sense, because you want to be rational. You want to be left-brained about everything, to make sure we have data to defend our position, so that we can go to the markets and say, well, here's why we did this, because we had great data. Even though it didn't work out, we had great data that proved that this was the right thing to do. But I actually challenge that. A lot of times companies think they make decisions based on data, but there are a whole lot of other things going on. Politics. I mean, not that any of your organizations would ever have politics. I'm sure they don't, but many organizations do have politics, and they matter in terms of making decisions and allocating resources. Emotions. How many times, how many things in your own life can you think of where you made decisions mainly based on emotion, mainly based on intuition and gut, and not at all based on data? In fact, and sometimes controverting the data in front of us. Confirmation bias. Every company, every organization has confirmation bias, which means I am going to seek the data that prove what I think I already know. So the next time somebody says, son, our business makes decisions on data. Now, I'm sure they won't be speaking like that, but, you know, that's, you know, kind of fun. Then think again. Getting to know people. What drives people, their emotions, their attachments, their interests, their loves. Somebody said that yesterday, another professor, love. And on that wonderful note, love, wow. Love, wow. Love. Love. Great, thank you. Let's go have lunch.
Okay, thank you for the conclusion. Before we finish, there is this small tradition at America has. We have to take pictures for all the speakers. So I would like to invite all the speakers, including Pak Hermawan, back on the stage to take pictures with our logo. Yeah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of At America, I would like to thank you for your participation and hope to see you guys soon later on our next event. Thank you and have a good day.
Trying to find myself, I get behind myself. I need to rewind myself, looking for the payback, listen for the playback. They say that every man bleeds just like me, and I feel like number one. Last in line, I watch my